I want to call the Smart Cities and Service Improvement Committee to order, and can we get a roll call, please?
Councilmember Diep. Present. Councilmember Davis. Here. Councilmember Kikamis.
Here.
Mayor Liccardo. And Chair Chappie Jones.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Okay. So the first item on the agenda is the Facebook Telegraph Innovation and Digital Strategy.
And we have a recommended deferral on that item.
Okay, can I get a motion to defer?
So moved.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Nothing on the consent calendar. Next item is the Innovation Roadmap. Do we have a speaker? Okay. So you said he can if it's deferred, or he can't? Cannot. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, Blair, but I know you'll be able to get it in on the, at least in the open forum part of it. Okay? All right, so. Oh, thank
We didn't hear what you said.
So Blair, you'll be able to speak to, if you want to throw it in, and when you speak in open forum, you can do that. All right, thank you. All right, Innovation Roadmap.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, members of the public. Kip Harkness, Deputy City Manager. I want to kind of bring us back to where we last left our heroes as we talked about the Innovation Roadmap, and then later the second item. So for the Innovation Roadmap, as a quick reminder, if we go back in ancient history to 2015, we have externally the strong innovation imperative to meet our customer and our citizens' expectations, but internally we do not have a strategy around innovation. Our government customer experience is what I would politely call traditional government. Our processes are inefficient, often not documented, often inconsistent. Our technology is outdated, and many of our people exhausted. Fast forwarding a bit, we get the adoption and direction from you in the Smart Cities vision, and then we begin to work on what we focus on within the Innovation Roadmap, which is defined by these three questions. Is it important because it's causing a lot of people pain or annoyance? Is it core to what the city can and should do? And is it actually achievable at scale with technology or process improvement, or both? Equally important as what we work on is how we work. We have three interrelated behaviors which we think drive innovation. Just like with health, if you adopt a series of interrelated behaviors, getting enough sleep, exercising, eating well, you're going to have healthy outcomes. We think that with innovation, if you champion the customer, learn through data, and iterate to improve, you will overall have innovation and improvements that come out of that work. So 2017, which is now in the rearview mirror, we were able to adopt a framework for innovation, both the vision level and at the roadmap level. We still have the traditional government experience, but we are gaining empathy and moving toward digital. We're exploring improvements to the process. We've narrowed down our focus. We're updating our technology with the idea of becoming brilliant at the basics and investing in both creating more of a platform approach and security, and we are increasingly engaging our people across the organization. So where we're going to spend a few moments today is this intersection between these two levels of planning. The top level is the long-term vision and the smart city vision that you've mapped out for us, and then the 12 to 18-month time frame of the innovation roadmap. Again, as a reminder, we went through an analysis of over 100 potential backlog items and focused in on about 23 or 24 items to place onto the roadmap. Prioritizing those, the darker the color is, the higher the prioritization, and then arranging them in similar allied product lines, you get a sense of what the roadmap is. When we last checked in with you, this was the status of the roadmap, mostly green and yellow, some issues. The light gray are the emerging items, and the dark gray are items that we've put on hold, specifically the Silver Spring Network and our demonstration policy. Flashing ahead to today, you can see we've had a shift. We've added the IoT strategy as a full-fledged item, and it is on track. And then we've had a couple of items that have shifted into the red, and I want to acknowledge those clearly, because part of our process and our belief is that we want to be open, candid, and direct, not only about what's going right, but what we're struggling with as well. So those two items that you see moving to the red, the first is citywide data architecture. This is essentially denoted by red because of a lack of resources. We've done some really innovative work with Dell EMC. They've loaned us some hardware, some VMware that's allowed us to put in place an approach to data which we think makes sense, but that was a temporary donation, and that's going back. So we are left with an outline of how we would approach the architecture, but without the hardware we need to actually implement. We'll be coming back to you in the annual budget with a recommendation on how to approach taking the architecture that we've drafted to scale, but with the current resources we have, we cannot put into place the architecture that we want in order to be able to do IoT and combine our existing systems. So this is not a crisis that needs to be dealt with today, but we wanted to be honest that unless we make the investments with the annual budget, we will not be able to meet the expectations around this. On the radar sensor module strategy, it's red for a different reason. We have a technology that was very cutting edge that allows us to look at an intersection and look at the traffic in that intersection and translate that analog information into digital information and be able to keep track of cars and movement in a very precise digital way. Unfortunately, when our staff went back and ground truthed that data, comparing the radar sensor module information with actual closed-circuit television of the same intersection, we saw extreme inaccuracies in the data, up to 50% inaccurate. The reason I think this is actually a good example of being red is that this was a demonstration policy, so there's no city money that's been expended on procurement, and the purpose of it was to test and learn with a new innovative technology. What we've learned is that at its current state, this is not a technology we would want to deploy at scale. So we're working with the vendor right now to see if there's the opportunity to improve the accuracy of that data, or if this is one of those ones that will end up peeling off of this and saying, we've learned a lot about the new technology, we understand what we want when we move forward. So moving onward, I did want to update you. We've done kind of the next levels down, which you shouldn't need to worry about, but I wanted to inform you of to give you a sense of the whole picture. We've done some beginning to have more of a discipline in release planning, and in particular thinking about the 6 months ahead and breaking the work into chunks. So last month we held an innovation roadmap project release planning session with over 24 project leaders celebrating victories from the past 6 months, engaging on best practices, and identifying top priority, clear goals for each project for the next 6 months. In addition to that 6-month release planning, we've now developed a project execution rhythm and cadence, where essentially every 2 months or so, each project comes before us, and we are able to understand the current status and then work together on solutions. So we've gone through and been able to demonstrate and engage with all of the items on the roadmap in the last, since August now. And then on the individual level, many of the projects are working on sprints and in an agile fashion. Very quickly, out of those demonstration projects and the 24 reviews that we've done since August, I wanted to highlight 2 execution examples of successes. One relates to the My San Jose app, which is obviously a premier initiative around how we work with our customers. We have 18,000 registered accounts, 64,000 service requests logged, an average of 1,500 requests per day, and then 55,000 closed requests. It also, that last one is a particular point toward the double-edged sword of what we're doing and how we're learning. We've been using the closed methodology as a way of talking about things, and it really didn't connect with how a customer experiences the service at all. And so an immediate upgrade that we're doing, we just released our 1.4 on the 31st. It dealt with some systems changes and some improvements to the customer service. Our 1.5 that we're starting to work on now will include sorting out that closed category into 4 different communications. One that says the work's actually complete, which is what most people think closed means. The second one is it's a duplicate request. Somebody else has requested it, so this is a duplicate request. And the third one is helping them know it's out of jurisdiction, and we're going to have to figure out how much information we can help on referral or what jurisdiction that is. And then the fourth one is it's scheduled, ideally, ultimately, with some sense of the timeline. But that gives you a sense with My San Jose that while we've made substantial progress, there is significant work to do with this particular system. And this is an example of something that is going to be, in my opinion, on the roadmap for a long time. And we will be coming to you in the annual budget again with a description of what it would take to not only improve the existing capabilities of the platform, but to do the business processing re-engineering on the actual services, to put in the dashboards to monitor the services and to manage the services on a data-driven way, and to reconfigure the platform itself so that it is less hardwired and customized and more configurable and modular so that we can add new services and functionality. Second example of success is our talent recruitment initiative. We did some very innovative design thinking led by the HR team itself. Bottom line, they have been able to take a system that had 15 steps and reduce that to 2. And they have been able to, over the past year, double their recruiting capacity and output. Vacancies have decreased by 25% from 890 to 670. This number is actually even better than it looks, in my opinion, because you have to remember at the same time we've added a couple hundred new positions, and we continue to see a wave of the silver tsunami of retirements. So we are decreased vacancies by 25% in an environment where we have a high natural attrition from retirements, and we have increased and added the positions as a whole. This is an example of a more mature innovation effort where the HR team itself now has the capacity to continue the work and continue the innovations. They've actually identified about 6 pilots, and they're working their way through those pilots, testing, learning, and scaling them as they go. So this is one of those items which probably pretty soon could actually come off of the innovation roadmap. And that brings me to my last point about the innovation roadmap, which is in 2018, we want to bring more of the real projects to you and demonstrate some of the interesting, cool, and complex things that we're doing so that you can interact with them a little more viscerally and provide us feedback. We also need to define a process for graduating victories, removing deprioritized projects, and adding new projects. We've had great success in using this as a tool to focus the organization, but it's got to be able to evolve and grow with new opportunities and as we complete the work. Finally, we've realized that the naming of it as an innovation roadmap is perhaps too narrow, and that we need to expand the naming to fit with what we're really trying to do, which is this larger smart city vision and this enterprise priority that the city manager has identified around smart and sustainable cities. So with that, I'll close on our goal, which is by 2020 to be as innovative as the community that we serve and be moving toward these delightful customer experiences, which are increasingly digital and mobile, a more agile process where we have the innovation behaviors of championing the customer, learning from data, and iterating to improve, and our technologies are enabling real platforms with a data architecture that is open and communicates and secure, and that our people are engaged. So with that, I will pause and take any question or feedback from the committee.
Thank you, Kip. Any questions? Councilmember Davis?
Thank you. Thank you, Kip, for the presentation and the update about the upcoming change to the My San Jose app. I have one question about the duplicate request item. Will the person who made the duplicate request be subscribed automatically to the one that remains open so that they can continue to know what's going on with that? Will that just automatically be put into their list of items?
Right. Excellent question. I'm going to ask Margaret Lamb, who's got a day-to-day on this product, to see how they're going to approach that one.
Thank you for the question, Councilman Davis. The normal procedure right now is we see that there is a duplicate request. we added a comment to the resident that says, this is the duplicate request. Please follow this request, and we provide the service request number for them to follow if they have not subscribed to it.
And so if in the enhancement, when it is a closed item and makes a duplicate request, will it just automatically subscribe them to that original request?
The thinking there is with the design, we're hoping to attach the duplicate request number as a reference. We're still trying to formulate how to implement this. But this is so that the work crew can easily pick one of the choices and provide a further level of explanation to the resident.
So I think, but let me make sure let me see if I'm following your logic, council member. From a customer standpoint, so if I'm logged in and I click on this abandoned vehicle and it's a duplicate request, I think the logic that you're suggesting is we can make the assumption that it's important to me and I'd want to subscribe to it. So rather than making an opt-in to a subscription, have we considered making it an opt-out
Exactly.
of the follow-up?
Right.
And do you have a perspective on that, Margaret?
We have to take a look at how exactly we're going to have to implement this smoothly, because this is across all the different service types. And some of the service types do not really necessarily need to provide explanation. For example, the graffiti abatement or pothole removals, because basically when the job is done, the residents can see it, right? This is more akin to like abandoned vehicles, street lights, where there are longer lead times to getting it resolved.
Right, yeah, exactly. And I think even if you subscribed to the graffiti one, I don't think anybody's going to get mad if they are subscribed to something that is then closed and has the picture in it that it's already done. I think what's more likely to happen, so I don't think that's a downside risk. I think the downside risk of not subscribing them automatically is higher, because I think, well, Kip knows because I forward him all the emails that I get about my San Jose where something is closed and not completed, that if you just automatically subscribe them, like they don't care what the request number is, right? It's just, that's on our end where the requests are duplicate because we have multiple request numbers. They don't care. All they care about is whether they can track it.
Right, and sometimes we also have a situation where the resident has logged in as anonymous user because they don't have a register logged in. So in those cases, they wouldn't be able to subscribe, or we wouldn't have a ability to send them the notification.
Okay, that's helpful. Do you have to, when you're using the app, you can use it anonymously? I can't remember what I did.
Yes, you can register with an account, or you can register anonymously. But in those cases, you wouldn't be able to get notification because there's not an email address to send it back to.
So at the risk of doing this in real time, I think what we'll do is we'll take the guidance back as we do the 1.5, and we'll see if we can do, we'll both want to see the technical feasibility of the automatic opt-in and see what that does with the customer experience.
Great,
and we'll
yeah,
keep you in
that'd
the
be
loop
really
on
helpful. I don't know if I'm signed in on the app or not, but basically you just have a list of requests, so I don't know if there's any way to do that.
Right. We'll
Great.
check into that. I think we've got the end in mind on that. I appreciate the feedback.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to say, again, thank you for that presentation, and particularly around the roadmap itself and the different, green, red, yellow. And so just my first question is, when we go from, say, green to yellow to red, how can we help or assist in terms of, removing any roadblocks or providing direction or guidance in terms of, moving those projects forward, or at least overcoming some of the roadblocks that you're encountering?
Mr. Chair, I appreciate the question. I think if for the most part, what we'll want to do is when there's sort of three types of problems that I think will particularly need your guidance on: policy-related issues, budget-related issues, and then relative prioritization as well. So for example, in the case of the citywide data architecture, we really do feel we need to bring back to you some of the budget-related issues as well as some of the policy approaches around that, and we can do that within the annual. With the radar sensing modular strategy, this is something where at this point we don't need any roadblocks cleared. So I guess my basic piece is that we will try to bring items in those categories back to you through this committee or through the council as a whole as appropriate. If there are pieces out of these discussions in the innovation roadmap updates that you think spark or merit a greater conversation, let us know, and then we can build those into the work plan for the next 6 months and come back with a more robust discussion. So if there's if there's a kind of a pattern that you notice that you're like, wait a minute, something around data or something around any particular one of these, we'd be happy to build those into future roadmaps, and signaling that to us now is always useful.
Great. Second question is on the closed request, and I'm glad that you went right there and talked about it in detail. Obviously, I'm having some issues with some of my residents in terms of they report something, and they get a response back that's closed, and it's still it's still broken or potholes still there. So it did create some confusion. The feedback loop. I know that my office has been sending those types of feedback to your department, and Dev has been doing the same thing. I'm assuming that the other council offices have been doing the same thing as well. Is there another feedback loop that we can do? Whether it's having the designers of the app actually go out and do their own testing of the app on potholes and debris and other things, that they can just real time have a feel for how the app is responding to their requests?
Right. I would say two things. One, keep that feedback coming, and feel free to send it directly to me. It's actually very useful both to kind of keep me current and also to make sure that I'm able to get it back to the staff and prioritize what's most urgent. I think that part of what we believe is the right approach is to empower the people doing the actual work with both the tools that they need to do this, but also the orientation to seek that feedback from their customers themselves. Part of where we have a disconnect is that some of the hardworking crews in the field don't have the visibility into some of this direct feedback and don't have all of the data, and it's not as directly connected to the way they do their day-to-day work as it needs to be responsive. So there's a fair amount of both supporting those teams and also taking a hard look at the business processes. So we've started some light touch look at some of the business processes, mostly to seek to understand how much work there is that's needed to be done. And our initial kind of assessment is that if we're serious about this, and I would like us to be, we're probably going to need to put some time into training those teams and bringing some outside resources to helping them work through what's that customer journey line look like. Spending some time listening to their actual customers, interviewing them, watching them use the app and see how they react. And all of that, I think, can be very, very powerful, because when the people who do the real work and who are really committed to doing it well see and feel their customer feedback, my experience is that voice of the customer really encourages people to deliver better service. So I want the connection not to be between me and the customer. I want it to be between the customer and the people delivering that service. But in order to do that, we need to invest in those teams and give them the capability to improve their own business processes. And that would be part of what we would come forward to you in the annual budget with an approach on. In the meantime, we'll do some lightweight prototyping on that. We started a little bit of work with the abandoned vehicles, which is one of the more complicated ones to figure out. And we'll use those lessons learned to inform how we think we can get a tighter connection between the customer and the actual teams delivering the work.
Great. And Councilmember Camus, you had a question?
So I'm concerned that the emergency management is still in the, I don't know if it's light gray or dark gray. Is it on hold, or is it it's emerging. Okay, now that it's expanded, I could see it's an emerging project. So considering that the mayor actually put some intense pressure in his last State of the City address, being a priority for our city, why is it an emerging project rather than at least a yellow?
That's a fair question, and I think this is not all of the emergency management work. That has, as you know, its own roadmap that you all have approved that we're working along. This is specifically kind of the innovation tech component of it, and the ability to use more innovative technology and more modern technology in our emergency operations center and in the work that we do to respond to emergencies. If I were to color code it at this point, it would actually be a red rather than a yellow, because this isn't yet resourced with where we want it to be. And so part of what I've done, just a judgment call, is since your direction as a council to us on the emergency management work was to focus on a core of the flood recovery, and then planning around related to the flood, and then the pivot toward the earthquake, that this becomes more of a question within the context of the annual budget. So I'd be happy to kind of color code it. If I had to put a color code on it, it would actually be red.
Okay.
And so yes, I share the concern.
Yeah, so this is more of the technology and not necessarily the preparedness.
Correct.
And teaching our population about, training, I should say, not teaching, but so that.
Correct.
Okay. On the talent recruitment initiative, I see it's green. Is there, what kind of measurements are you using to measure your success in our, you know, our work on this area? I know it used to take a heck of a long time to get through HR to get a job here. Is there a new measurement, or is there new data that shows things are getting better?
Yeah, so a couple of the key measures that we use around the talent recruitment in particular are how fast is the recruitment, what's the time it takes in the recruitment, how many positions we can move through in a given time, and then how many positions we're able to move kind of per recruiter are some of the key measures that we look at. We also keep an eye on quality to make sure that we aren't just moving faster and getting poor quality recruits in. So of those first three measures, we're not so much focused on shortening the time, because we'd actually had a pretty decent amount of time in the 50-day range. What we realized was we had a wholly inadequate number of people going through the process there. So at one point, I remember talking to you all, and we had about 8 positions open for the entire city on the website. And so our emphasis on the measure was maintaining that relatively adequate speed through the process, and radically and dramatically increasing the number of positions we could hire at the same time without decreasing the quality, as based on feedback from the hiring employees and some of the performance results that we get in the first 6 months on probationary employees. So I can bring back more detailed data, and HR has some more detailed data on that, but the bottom line is we've been able to maintain about the same hiring timeline and go to a much higher volume while maintaining the same quality. So at this point, we've been tracking a high level of data on all of those areas, and we can come back with a more comprehensive report. But that's how we've been doing the work as we piloted it, and now as we scale.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll look forward to getting more detailed report. Thank you again for your work.
Okay, we have a public comment from Blair on this topic.
Hi, thank you. This was nice and informative. I'm interested in the safe city emergency management tech data idea. as an emerging project. That sounds a bit hopeful. It sounds nice. Thank you. When you talk about the community process, community satisfaction, and those things you're working towards, you know, to speak, you know, in what I know about, to create the idea of civil protections and civil rights with this technology, I think would just be an incredibly valuable tool in the learning process for the community, and the idea of customer service. It just adds an incredible dimension to the idea of what customer service can be. And you know, what wasn't mentioned in your 2018 roadmap at all was the idea of how to invite a civil protection process and public process and guidelines and those kind of things that I just think would just knock the socks off the community. I think the community would just be in love with you. I think they would just say, this is democracy. We are really working this. And they'd be really happy. So I hope you can learn how to incorporate that kind of thinking into your roadmap plans. And yeah, that's pretty much it for now. Your board, your smart board, I've noticed, is made up of nothing but corporate people, large corporate IT people. And you know, to take a page from the SAG lessons from the City Council meeting a few days ago, it would be nice to invite just more everyday public to this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Blair, for that insight. Mary, you had...
Thank you. Yeah, could we go back to the roadmap, John? I'm sorry. As you're working on that, I'll just ask a question. This may have already been asked. If that's the case, I'll just take my answer another time offline. The whole issue about closed cases, that's already been asked. Okay, so we're working on that. Okay, great. Thank you. My apologies for the redundancy. And again, I'm sorry for coming in late because I know some of these questions have been asked already. You know, Kip, we've had some conversation offline about this. There are certainly smaller innovations, smaller pilots that we can launch with seemingly much less staff engagement than some of these projects, right? And the problem we have is that we just don't have room sort of on this roadmap, the way it's structured now. And its structure is such in some way, I think, that may be inhibiting our ability to take on things that could be relatively low effort, but significant benefit. And so how do you propose we create room for that kind of opportunity?
So I think you are correct that the kind of the double-edged sword of the innovation roadmap is it gives us a clear focus on what we're doing, but it is more of a 12 to 18-month time frame and doesn't allow us necessarily to be as flexible to emergent smaller opportunities in particular. I think that there is the possibility to create the capacity to do that. I think a couple of things that we would need is, and we've been having some discussions with some potential nonprofit partners on this, is a way to kind of vet and funnel those ideas so that we can sort out the wheat from the chaff pretty quickly. And then a little bit of capacity in our side of the shop to really work with those lightweight projects and move them and test and pilot. At this point, I wouldn't want to, unless I'm directed otherwise, sort of say no to anything on this roadmap in order to say yes, but I think that we could build in some capacity to do some lightweight stuff with a relatively small amount of resources. But my sense is that we'd want to do that with a nonprofit partner who can help us think about the ecosystem and move quickly on that, and we'd want to be open to probably time boxing some of these engagements so that we could bring several through, work with them pretty rapidly, and then learn from them. And if at that point we want to add them onto the bigger innovation roadmap, we could pull them on board.
Right.
But that's my thinking's pretty vague at this point. But I do feel like in order to have that capacity, we could test and learn on that in the course of the year if we had the ability to bring the right nonprofit into partnership and somebody on board on the city side who could run that process.
Right. Okay. I guess the other concern, and I know we've had some conversation about that, is there are items on this that are simply business as usual. These are things we have to do. Integrated permitting system, business tax system, these are software implementations we have to do. There's nothing additive or unique about these beyond the fact it just takes a lot of work and integration, and we know that's bandwidth and staff time. Other items on this list, I don't know if the council has really been sort of engaged in saying transportation events tracking is our priority, for example, or Silver Spring Networks really hasn't gone anywhere for a year and a half. Why don't we just drop it and move forward? And so I'm concerned that this has become a bit of a sclerotic model that's not allowing us to be able to be more nimble. And so if that means, we should go back to council and let's have council weigh in and say, this isn't where we want to focus our energy and time, I think that might be helpful. But I'm not sure this is a roadmap to innovation. I feel as though this is kind of a structure that is not giving us collectively as an organization the ability to be able to take advantage of to be opportunistic where we need to be, and then obviously be strategic where we critically need to be over the great majority of our work. And so I'm just wondering, have we thought about how exactly this roadmap changes moving forward? What does this look like 6 months from now, a year from now, and how does that change happen?
Well, I would say I have a very different perspective of the value and the utility of this roadmap, especially focusing on the core systems. But in terms of how it changes, what we talked about a few moments ago was the idea of what is the process to graduate victories, to deprecate lower priority items, and to be able to add on new ones. And I do think it is the time in 2018 to do that engagement, and I think it is appropriate to bring council more into that prioritization, because again, it's simply a matter of prioritization. And so if we want to pivot towards some of the more pure innovation work, I think that's quite possible to do within the context of the innovation roadmap. The caution I would say, and I think the business tax system and the integrated permitting system are actually very good examples. We recently brought in the business tax system to our regular execution rhythm conversation. And one of the really engaging and positive conversations we had with the team was really problem solving and thinking beyond the product launch, and understanding about how you get customer feedback from small businesses who may use the system only once a year. And how do you incorporate a way of getting that customer feedback into a pretty highly structured and complex procurement process. And so I would absolutely agree with you. There's really nothing innovative about a business tax system, but without the attention and approach around championing the customer, learning from data, and iterating to improve that is inherent in our innovation approach, I think we miss some opportunities on some of these core systems. So if that needs to be on the innovation roadmap, or if that should simply be business as usual taking elsewhere, I think we could have that discussion with council. And so it sounds like for 2018, there's an appetite to look at this differently on your part. But I have a very different perspective on whether this is a sclerotic roadmap. I think it's a very dynamic roadmap that puts us ahead of the curve of almost every city I've seen out there in terms of moving the actual organization forward on a number of very important items.
Yeah, I guess what I would suggest is that if we think, look, championing the customer, for example, is a principle that I appreciate that you've been very strong in advocating in this organization. It's a principle we should be adopting in every department, right? This is not just the innovation team's principle. And so I guess I am concerned that the work of the whole city organization suddenly becomes the role of sort of the innovation team, rather than carving out a role for the innovation team which is unique, and that is looking for ways to do business much differently, as we absolutely have to do by necessity because of our very constrained resources, for all the reasons already, and our very constrained staffing. And so I'm just concerned that we've got such an enormous amount of time of the innovation team being sort of sucked into all these other functions that doesn't give you or your team the ability to do the creative work and to do the more nimble work. and the opportunistic work where it might exist. And so that's sort of my general concern as I look at this, and it covers a lot of different areas in the city. And so I look forward to talking about how this roadmap really does change. So it doesn't look the same as it did last year, except for a few different colors, that we're really actually seeing things move, and move off in some cases where we know it's just not, like Silver Spring Networks, we know it's been dead for a year. I mean, it's probably time just to take it off and think about, failing forward and moving on to other things. So that's really where I'm going.
Yeah, it feels like it might be useful to come back with a kind of a principles discussion around how do we want to restructure this, and what do you want to, from a council perspective, what do you want to see come off, and what do you want to see the focus on? Because it is a matter of what the eyes on the prize are, right? And if the eyes of the prize is creating more space to be very rapidly and nimbly innovating on opportunities as they come, this may not be the way to get you there. So I would suggest that we would probably want to do that first within this committee, and do that sooner rather than later. So I'll see what we can do about adding something to the agenda in a future committee session that we can deep dive into that and get your direction on what would the criteria be, the appropriate criteria be for moving things off, adding things off, and focusing the limited resources of this team.
Okay, great. And then the red light on the citywide data architecture, we need a chief data officer, basically. Is that what it comes down to?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not that easy.
Okay.
We need a significant amount of hardware, and we need the investments in the software architecture in order to be able to have the capacity to create the kind of data lake that we want. So Dell EMC very generously, under a demonstration agreement, had worked with us, donated temporarily some VMware and some other hardware that allowed us to kind of create a small-scale version of what we need, but the long-term investments is a combination of both hardware, software, and people.
Yeah. Any back of envelope sense of what kind of orders of magnitude we're talking about?
Expensive. Yes, it's a multi-million-dollar investment with continual operations. So if Rob wants to come up and back me up, but the bottom line from my perspective is that, as you're going toward this converged approach, you really have to, and I'm going to skip over and let Rob just fill right in there.
Actually, yeah, so we do want to give a proper credit. We had Dell EMC as our partner. They brought in the hardware as well as the services. We proved out the architecture at scale. What we're missing is the environment that we own to carry that forward. So that architecture allowed us to scale up to IoT level usage, which is potentially tens of thousands of devices and terabytes generated per day, and that additive use plus use cloud-based resources. On the simple number, the immediate needs in terms of getting an environment stood up is right around the 200 to 300,000 mark, plus the transparency portal and other components would be about 150 to 250. The long swing on the millions, though, is as IoT continues to grow, that continuous data is ginormous. And how are we hospitable to that, and how do we manage that? What are the retention rules, the records management component of that? Still has to be worked out over time. But
And Rob, what was your swag on doing this citywide the way that the architecture requires?
About $400,000 for our first run at it.
No, the scale, at scale version.
The full scale?
Yeah.
Full scale is about $1.5 million. Yeah.
Okay, so the numbers sounds like it's somewhere around 2 million. Is that right?
Yeah, for the growth that we're expecting on IoT, yes.
And is there some hope that Amazon figures this out, or this becomes cheaper sometime soon, or?
So the way the architecture is built is that there's not going to be one cloud provider, but they will be using lots of them because depending on your use, will be a different vendor and a different cloud environment. But yes, we're seeing the costs decrease, but more slowly than we're seeing the data increase.
Right.
And that's why you see a select few like Amazon, Facebook, and Google. They've been able to harness this new era, but it will become more approachable. We would assume with time.
Okay. So I understand we're stuck right now. I'm just trying to figure out if there's a path to becoming unstuck.
Yeah, the optimization of where we adopt it and our potential uses and the technology and cost catching up. Right?
Yeah.
And in the grand scheme of things, this actually replaces a number of inadequate individual systems. So to a certain degree, over time, it's a wash because as we invest in a centralized system that does this right, we deprecate the old systems. But in the immediate, it's a dual investment that needs to be parallel because we can't just turn off everybody's other database that they're already using. But in the long run, there are some efficiencies to be gained that make this a little bit less.
So in a happy world where we had one-time money fall from the sky, this might be a good investment from the standpoint of being able to make those longer-term cost savings in the other areas. Is that right, Kip?
Yeah, and
That's correct.
Kip's absolutely right. And what we suffer from right now is a lot of fragmented data systems.
Yeah.
And so when we try to make smart IoT plays, the data is all strung out, and we can't make those smart perceptions and see those patterns and make those actions and decisions. So one system that by default is the home of all of our utilization and the data is what we pursue, and that's that architecture and what's built to do. Hadoop, Spark, so it's built for high-end use.
Yeah.
But then we would grow into it.
And just to get into the weeds for a moment, because it's kind of fun, is that the process to do the cutover from the current systems to the new one is a very big and heavy lift, and would require essentially a lot of leadership focus for that period of time. So when my crew ran the cutover from eBay to PayPal and stood up all the new systems, you essentially have to block out a period of time where the entire organization is committed to taking all that stuff off and standing it up on the new devices. And so that's a period where the one-time money is not just for the hardware and the software and the services that are required, but also the focus internally that we need to make sure that we're spending the time to migrate that all over. Because if you just leave it on the old systems and stand up the new, you don't get any of the efficiencies.
Okay.
And if I can add to that, one of the things we've talked about internally and across departments is if we don't do it intentionally, what we will see is the departments will bring the solutions that they see for their one area, one by one by one by one.
Right.
And you'll organically grow into a very disheveled environment, right?
Right.
So
We've seen that before, that movie. So I know this isn't the time to talk budget, but it would be really helpful if at some point the bright minds might converge to provide some input around along the lines of a city manager's budget document that could articulate sort of what those short-term costs are and so forth, particularly if they're long-term savings. I think the council would really want to know, what could we get with an investment now?
Appreciate and understood, and that's exactly the reason for putting this red, is that it at the moment we've tested out and proved out the architecture, which is what the pilot was intended to do, but in order to scale, we're going to need significant investment. So this was essentially intended to signal that, and then our work now is to put together a coherent approach to this and come forward as part of the annual budget cycle with some recommendations.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you, Mayor. Councilmember Camus had another question.
Sorry, second bite at the apple here. We had talked about putting together a data privacy policy. That is not on the matrix here.
Yeah, it's a good point. It is actually part of the work that is inherent in the IoT strategy and the LED Anycom pilot. So both a privacy policy and a security policy around data, our use of data, and a security approach are absolutely essential. I would view them, and maybe we'll put them in, they're almost bars that go down both sides of this roadmap. If we don't create a modern approach to privacy and a robust and modern approach to security, much of what's in between here can't or shouldn't be done. So those are essential, and I think we need a better way of illustrating that those are core components of the work that we're doing. So good call out.
Well, nice to hear that. Where is the policy coming together? Are you going to be presenting the actual written policy?
We have a working group that we're starting to work with, and it was synced up with the work on the Anycom pilot, but we'll be working over the next several months to be developing an internal draft and then bringing that through this committee and to council.
So how many months did you say?
I don't have a timeline yet because I've asked the working group to come back with me with a schedule. I don't have a schedule yet from them.
Okay, could you, when you ask that, can you put that on your list to update us on as to what the working group says?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Mayor, you had another question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Had another.
Hey, can we put timelines on these items on the roadmap?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Just in terms of like when we expect the flower to bloom, and if not, then we'll just move on, right? Because we all got lots of things we want to accomplish. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Kip. Thank you for that report. Can I get a motion?
Motion to approve?
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor? All right, motion passes. Thank you. Next item, digital inclusion and broadband strategy update.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Honorable Mayor, City Council. The presentation will be up in a second here. So since we, I'm sorry, I'm Dolan Beckel. I assumed everyone knew that. That's a bad assumption. Dolan Beckel, Office of Civic Innovation. Since the digital inclusion and broadband strategy was approved on November 12th, we've made significant progress in 2 areas that I'm going to summarize here, and then we'll provide more detail throughout this verbal report. So in the first area, broadband governance, since the council approved the strategy, we initiated broadband deployment partnership negotiations with 3 major broadband providers. I will not be mentioning them here. We received a commitment to deploy 200 gigabit level small cells throughout the city in an equitable fashion. And that's important. Just because we have a master license agreement doesn't mean there's any actual demand from the broadband providers to deploy it. There's no commitment. We shepherded the permitting process to bring the first wave of small cells online in December. We agreed on significant private sector investment, and by significant, it's over $1 million to help the city improve its permitting processes. We generated new revenue commitment to support proposed additional staff at mid-year, and by new revenue, I mean revenue from small cell leases and small cell permitting fees. Despite having a master licensing agreement since 2015, the city had not collected any small cell revenue until last month. In the area of vertical infrastructure, small cell permitting remains a focused top priority. The first wave of small cells are in Santana Row. They were permitted, installed, and inspected, and are now in service. We're currently working with broadband providers on the next wave of small cells and fiber, and that next wave will be more equitable than the initial deployment. And while we have a lot of room to improve, we are learning and implementing improvements to increase our speed and predictability. Just to recap the strategy from November 12th, during that meeting, we discussed the spectrum of intervention the city might take, anywhere from being purely market-driven, which is where we've been about the last decade, to being purely government-led. And the accepted recommendation was the hybrid approach, and that recommends first pursuing with the broadband providers, exploring the tipping point where just enough city intervention and investment incents private sector build-out. We also discussed the fact that the recommendations approved support government-led interventions in municipal broadband where appropriate in areas including but not limited to equitable deployment and digital inclusion. So our hope is that through investment from the city side, we reach that tipping point to the point we incent private sector build-out, but that does not exclude us, if necessary, from going to more of a government-led approach. The next slide is a recap of the benefits that we would see in the city of San Jose with a new citywide wired and wireless build-out. These are from a recent Accenture study and also a study from the University of Oklahoma. It's a significant addition of construction equipment over a period of 7 years, over $2 billion in GDP growth, $600 million in select smart city benefits from having an infrastructure in place, $80 million in direct economic benefit to those who have been excluded and now having internet access at home. More choice, better quality, and lower price if we're able to incent the competition through the lower cost of build and additional policies, and of course increased opportunity from digital inclusion for higher educational, job acquisition, career development, and improved mental health. Just a recap of the strategy and the expected benefits. As we also discussed, finding that tipping point requires unlocking the value we have in city assets. Currently, there's 2 assets that we have found immediate value to the broadband providers. Those are street light and our traffic poles, which are ideal siting for wireless devices. And also, we found value in working on streamlining our policies, processes, and governance which can be used to improve the speed and predictability of permitting to install while retaining local control over equitable and inclusive build-outs. And each of these assets is being leveraged in our current partnership discussions. Another recap here is the concept of the value exchange. In this case, when we look at our small cell lease rate, the city can invest lowering the cost of broadband deployment and promoting investment in broadband outcomes, those outcomes being the private sector investment in economic development for the city, digital inclusion for our underserved, and third priority, smart city and IoT support. The strategy also recognized the need for two forms of upfront investment. First, to ensure we have a critical mass of staff or just muscle to accelerate the permitting process. The strategy recommended that we incent the broadband providers to upfront the costs of permitting in lieu of transactional permitting fees. This provides basic fiscal confidence in securing the people for the demand that's to come. And second, our strategy also recognized the need for significant technology and process improvement to achieve a run rate of approximately 20 small cell installs per week. And in the short term, we may need to value trade some of that lease asset value for an investment in our permitting improvements. So you might think of this as the broadband providers helping us help themselves. It's a near-term one-time investment that if we accelerate the permitting process, it multiplies across every permit that any broadband provider would apply for. And then in the medium and long term, of course, our asset lease revenue becomes the primary tool to promote an equitable build-out and digital inclusion. So given the current legislative discourse around broadband, I chose to leverage some recommendations from a negotiating guide, Getting to Yes by Roger Fisher. So we began our discussions by identifying the interests that the city and the broadband providers would have in accelerating broadband. And some of these you might expect, but it was a good process to go through. From the broadband providers, their interests in priority order are speed, predictability, cost savings, and then specific location-based project barriers, the challenges of putting fiber downtown, for example. San Jose's interest to our broadband strategy had already been defined. Clearly, number one was economic development, more choice, better quality, lower price. The second was support for digital inclusion, and the third relative interest was support for IoT. We did not and will not fully agree on all of these interests. We came to understand each other's interests, and we found some joint interests to move forward. The first was speed and predictability. While ensuring public safety and infrastructure longevity, we agree that it is in both sides' interest to accelerate broadband speed and predictability as fast and as much as possible given the current state of our infrastructure. Moving at the speed of business accelerates deployment, and if we do that in conjunction with revised policies that foster competition, we can translate to reduced costs for the public. We agreed there are improvements to be made to our permit to install process, and as I mentioned earlier, the private sector agreed to make an investment in our improving our own process capability that has much broader multiplication for everyone, all the broadband providers who might use our processes. We agreed that there is value in the private sector making that upfront revenue contribution for permitting fees. So we have agreement that the providers would front about $800,000 in capital so that we have the confidence to then hire the people to do the permitting, and in turn, that's in lieu of the actual permitting fees. We agreed that there is value to the private sector and the public sector to publish jointly agreed improvements in the permitting process to help out local authorities and broadband providers accelerate while retaining local control. And we did agree that an equitable deployment of infrastructure in support for breaking down the digital inclusion barriers can be supported in a value exchange for lease rates. So from these joint interests, we entered into partnership negotiations, two of which I'm going to take the somewhat theoretical discussion we just had and make it specific to the nature of these two negotiations. This information is within the bounds of our NDA and has been approved by our attorney's office. So I'm going to go through two negotiations. We have one I call the incremental negotiation, and the other is the citywide negotiation. In the incremental negotiation, we've agreed on a framework for a larger citywide scale deployment but for many reasons we chose to date before we walked down the aisle. It should be noted that this discussion started with a very strained relationship due to some missteps by the city in our small cell permitting, and we've come a long way from the broadband provider not wanting to deploy any next generation technologies in San Jose to where we are today with this agreement. So elements of this green incremental negotiation is the technology is focused on wireless. The initial scope and scale will be 200 4G small cells. There are additional value propositions that we're discussing, including not only an equitable deployment, but support for digital inclusion in future amendments to the agreement. In this negotiation, the permitting improvement and grant in the amount of $1 million will help us begin to re-engineer our processes and our technology. There's an upfront investment, quote-unquote investment of about $850,000 to allow us to bring on staff to rapidly to ramp up the team, and that will be in lieu of those cost recovery permitting fees. And thirdly, we've agreed to a deployment of those small cells equitably about San Jose. I mentioned the first round in Santana Row, but if you overlay our infamous digital inclusion heat map with the map of the small cells, there is a good equitable distribution of these 200 small cells that all elements of the community will be able to begin to leverage. The new lease revenue over 5 years is $1,500,000, and the new permitting revenue, which again is cost recovery but is considered revenue, will be $500,000. The status of this negotiation is we have joint signature of a letter of intent. Our attorney's office has agreed on the agreement, and we are expecting some red lines back from the broadband provider's legal view today or tomorrow. So we have high confidence that this is going to move forward. One line item that I missed was the San Jose value traded. We did provide a discount on the lease rate within the bounds of our existing policy. So the annual lease rate on these site licenses will be anywhere from $1,300 to $1,800 a year. The second negotiation is the citywide negotiation. And this broadband provider is basically betting their business model that this is the future and wired connections to the home is not. This is a citywide negotiation. The broadband provider chose to negotiate a complete citywide 7-year deployment of the technology. The scope of the initial scope and scale is wireless through small cells and for commercial wired fiber. Again, not going to wired fiber to residential, they're not betting that that is the future. The initial scope and scale would be 300 4G small cells, 3,000 5G small cells, hundreds of miles of fiber, and 3 to 4 new or resited macro cell towers. There are additional value propositions in the area of public safety and transportation that we're looking at in this agreement. Part of the value traded from the provider is they proposed a re-engineering project. Also, they have their own re-engineering team of Six Sigma black belts, and they propose bringing those people in to look at our processes and help us think of smarter, faster, better ways of doing that, while of course retaining the local control that we need over aesthetics, equity, and inclusion. They also agreed to up the upfront investment of fronting of that permitting fee so that we have the fiscal confidence in bringing on staff. And this being a citywide deployment by our own policy was an equitable deployment, but also was including a significant contribution of hotspots and free access through those hotspots. The current value traded, we're in middle of this negotiation, so the current value trade we're talking about is the small cell lease discount. We're still negotiating back and forth on numbers and what that looks like, so I don't have a number for that. The new permitting revenue over the 7 years would be $7,500,000 approximately. And the negotiation status is we're working on a letter of intent that will move into an agreement. And one note for council is this agreement might deviate from existing policy on the small cell lease. And given the timing of modifying our policies versus getting this agreement in place, we decided the best approach was to bring to council an agreement that might have a deviation from existing policy. On the next slide, I thought this might be an appropriate time, speaking of policy, is to talk about our much aligned and misunderstood leasing policy for small cells. It seems pretty straightforward to me. This was our policy established in 2015, but there's been a lot of questions, so we felt it was proper to bring the right attention to it. The city is zoned into 3 tiers to incent small cell deployment and economic development in underserved areas. So you see here we have 3 zones which have rates, annual lease rates, that go from a lower number to a higher number. In addition, the Director of Economic Development within the existing policy may discount an additional 50% to support economic development in underserved communities. This is the tool, this is the unlocking of the value that we've been doing over the last 7 weeks to get those first 200 small cells agreed to and negotiate future agreements. So we're taking advantage of that foresight that was put into our lease agreement from 2015. Our strategy recommends updating this policy further to incent citywide deployments, reflect the current state of the broadband market, new technologies, and even further incent equity and digital inclusion. So with the additional, I guess I should call it new quote-unquote revenue, that being from the small cell leases as well as the permitting as well as the investment, we're proposing some mid-year staffing additions. I look at this simply as broadband governance is generating demand and the vertical infrastructure team is fulfilling the demand. It's an interesting chicken or the egg, because if I generate too much demand and we're not ready to fulfill it, we fail. If we don't spend enough time generating demand, then we don't have anything to fulfill. So we're adding people to both teams under broadband governance. We're bringing in a broadband manager to help me with the negotiations with these broadband providers, because they are stacking up. We have 3 other broadband providers that, after the council approved the digital inclusion and broadband strategy, proactively reached out to us to talk about our strategy and negotiating agreements. We're bringing on a policy analyst, because we have 3 heavy lift policies, one of which being the privacy and data security. We're bringing on, propose bringing on a demonstration manager, again, to support the existing demonstration projects as well as new demonstration projects, one of which being a micro-trenching and nano-trenching project that several broadband providers have asked if the city would be pursuing, and that would make sense because we ourselves want to know if there are faster, cheaper ways than digging down 2 feet to lay fiber and coax. Also, under vertical infrastructure, we're proposing bringing on 4 people, the most important of whom, and probably the most important right now across the board in broadband, is a principal engineer to lead the team in public works. I look at this as a factory, and it's not an art, it is a science, and we can get better, faster, and cheaper, but we need a leader there to drive a number of different principles, and this role is really the intersection of a leader, a manager, an engineer, and almost, I call it, a visual aesthetician, because we have to work with the public on how we are going to, where and how we put these small cell devices up. And so it's a very unique role, and it is really key to getting the factory moving better, faster, and cheaper. We have actually added already a key resource, which is an electrical engineer. It's very challenging to find electrical engineers that aren't working for private sector companies making lots more money, and we were fortunate enough to find a retiree who would come back and help us with the electrical engineering reviews that are necessary for these small cell permits. Something that we'll need to pay attention to is there are 3 heavy lift policies that are on the council prioritization session for April, May, that being privacy and data security. We do have a working group, but in looking at the lift that it took other cities to do this, we're understaffed and we need support and priority for that. The dig once is also a heavy lift because it's not just making things less obtrusive as we do construction. This is working with the private sector and the broadband providers to develop an approach that will accelerate broadband across everyone. That is also a heavy lift. And then the third, which will be a little bit easier, is the small cell master licensing agreement. But all 3 of these are on the council policy priority session set for April, May, and we need your support to be able to move them forward and continue to develop policies that accelerate broadband. So next steps are to conclude the first round of negotiations and bring forward agreements for council consideration and approval. As I mentioned, these may require an exception to policy. The second is to prioritize those policies and the revised policies that reflect broadband-friendly approaches, because we do need additional resources to work those. We need to recruit and onboard those additional team members to both the Civic Innovation Team and Public Works and Transportation. And last but not least, we need CMO approval on a major enhancement to our asset management database that will allow the city to retain more holistic and more accurate data on our poles and attachments. It's a funded project. It just needs CMO approval, and this will be a major step forward in actually knowing what infrastructure we have out there and what state it's in and how many attachments it has, because right now our data is not very accurate. In terms of process improvements that we have made and that we have in backlog to make, we recognize there's a lot of room, but we have implemented things that make the process go faster. We found the optimal batching within our infrastructure, which is actually to batch small cell permits by lighting circuit. Leave it at that. We're also doing immediate site surveys because we have found the accuracy of our data is so low that it's better to get the broadband providers out there day one to look at the sites to make sure what we see in our data is actually what we see with our eyeballs. We're having weekly conference calls with the 2 broadband providers who have small cells in flight. It's a fairly open door policy. Both the city and the Public Works team and the engineering teams from the broadband providers are working closely together, not leaving issues open, but if there's an issue, send an email, make a call, we resolve the issue and the team moves forward. And lastly, very important, because most of our light poles are powered by the traffic signal system, we published electrical load calculation guidelines so people aren't guessing how we calculate a part of our approval process. So seems like small steps, but they are steps toward making things go faster. Things we have in our backlog that will make a bigger difference is aesthetic design guidelines by pole type. We have 10 different poles, and we have to develop guidelines and standards to make it very clear how to submit an application so that it goes faster. We'll have electrical and structural remediation designs as well. We're going to be pre-approving contractors for remediation and make ready so that it's clear that if a broadband provider wants to do something, that's who they work with, and they can work with them directly. That'll take us out of the middle once they've been pre-approved and understand our guidelines. And because of a factory approach, it makes sense to adopt Scrum, which you may have seen the invasion of the stickies throughout the City Hall tower. And as soon as we get the mid-year staffing in place, we have a Encore Fellow Scrum Master targeted that will start working with the Public Works team to begin working in a more repetitive Scrum approach, agile approach to doing work. So putting that all on the page, the gold shows the strategy approved, but it also shows mid-year budget approval, which we've got a number of resources that are critical to moving broadband faster in the city. And we also have, in the April-May timeframe, the policy prioritization, which is important so we can get the right focus and the right attention on these heavy lift policies. Beyond that, this timeline is pretty straightforward. We'll be recruiting and onboarding additional people pending the mid-year budget approval. We'll continue to work on improving process technology and data, and once these agreements are signed, we'll have funding or black belts here helping us improve our processes. And then, of course, we'll be continuing to deliver broadband throughout the next 7 years. So that concludes the broadband update.
Thank you, Dolan. Any questions from the committee? Mayor?
Thank you. First, thank you, Dolan. Sounds like there's been an enormous amount of progress here, and it's great to see, particularly on the citywide contract that's contemplated. Is that a matter of weeks off, or days, or months?
Well, I think the key is you might expect, Mayor, from the current discourse is that the challenge is going to be if we're able to get what I would consider a total project cost that includes equity and inclusion supported. And I think we are probably 2 weeks away from looking at numbers and determining if that pans out or not.
Great.
And we'll do everything we can to make it pan out. And if it doesn't, then the broadband clock is 1 minute closer to midnight.
Okay. Got it. I've often wondered what exactly is our lease rate, because I've heard varying estimates, some from industry, some articulated in federal and state forums publicly that we're somehow out there charging $15,000 a small cell, which of course I know not to be correct. So it looks like we're somewhere between 2,800 and 3,800 annually, depending on the zone.
That's correct. We have some other pricing algorithms that are mentioned that admittedly have been confusing the market.
Yeah.
And can also be misrepresented on purpose.
Yes.
So in these negotiations, the first thing we have done is clarified that these are our numbers and there's no other numbers. And so yes, for this year, our lease rates are running between 27 and 37. And on a transactional basis, that's what they're going to be until we change the policy.
Right.
But as we have incentive, we can discount the up to 50% beyond these numbers.
For batch and for public benefits.
Correct.
Right. Okay. So where does one visually see this? Is there a Municode provision where this shows up? Or-
We have a master licensing agreement. And in that master licensing agreement, there are rate tables, and these show up in the rate tables.
So when I know you've been involved in this too, when we're in Sacramento or DC, we can say, aha, here's the numbers.
Correct.
Okay, good.
Yes.
So then, I know you've also seen industry efforts of various kinds to streamline, some of them good ideas, right? Checklists of various kinds. Are those things that we're incorporating ourselves into our process?
Yes, we can certainly do a better job of publishing guidelines, detailed guidelines more proactively and more detail. And that is one of the first process improvements that's on the radar scope. And that's one of the first jobs that this principal engineer would
Folks
take
that we're
on.
gonna be hiring.
Right.
Yeah, and I understand we're constrained by staff, so I'm glad to see it's in mid-year. Because I know our advocacy would go a whole lot easier if we could say we're a model and the industry loves us because we've got all this stuff we're doing. And I know the industry doesn't love us because we're also advocating for the public in ways that they don't appreciate. But it would just be great if we could hold ourselves out in that way, and particularly for those who are skeptical on the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of these ideas that are on the in the backlog are all things we want to do, but we've so far with the limited staff we've been balancing getting we have 400 small cell applications in flight. Right. So we're trying to balance the speed of getting them through with becoming more efficient through process engineering, which is why we will be able to use the additional staff, especially the senior engineer, principal engineer, to develop these backlogged process improvements.
Okay. And if this is something you'd rather describe in greater detail offline to technology dummies like me, I'm happy to take this answer offline. But a lot of discussion around 5G deployment right now. But 5G technology isn't going to be here till 2020 or later, it sounds like. Is that right?
There are trials going on now in cities like San Jose and others. Based on where San Jose is, we need to get our 4G enhancements in place before 5G, which I think is okay because that gives the technology time to harden and bake and go through a few iterations. So I think that we will be in the citywide negotiation. We are looking at 2 years of 4G work on the small cells and the new macro cell towers, and then in year 3 through 7 is when the 5G would come online.
And there's no leapfrogging opportunities here.
One of the demonstration projects we're talking about, that micro trenching and nano trenching, we would propose hooking that. We would be testing that trenching as well as the fiber to some 5G small cells.
Okay.
So we would do we'd learn about whether micro-trenching and nano-trenching holds up, and we would also learn about 5G at the same time.
Okay. So although I have, I think, like an Apple 7 that I know has been systematically designed to slow down, according to some critics. Even if I had an Apple 10 or iPhone 10, that still wouldn't get me to 5G today, right? So when exactly do people actually get to communicate in some way utilizing 5G? Is that a couple years off?
No, there is the first deployment of 5G handsets, and all I can say is by some manufacturer within the next 6 months.
Really? That fast?
That's
Okay,
right.
so it's here.
It's here. It's an evolving standard. I mean, there are lots of, let's just say, functions within 5G, so you're not going to see all those functions in the first
Okay.
handset in the same way you didn't see all the functions you want in my San Jose, but it will get there.
It's good because I'm too broke to get an iPhone.
And part of what we're seeing in the adoption of this is an acceleration of the acceleration, right? So it took a long time to go from 3G to 4G. It's going to take a lot less time to go from 4G to 5G once they decide on it. Partly because they'll make all of our equipment obsolete, but so
It's a good business model.
so I think what we like structurally about this is that by the time 5G is real, we will have our systems in place, our structures in place with what we've learned through 4G, and we are taking into account the future of 5G now and the way that we negotiate, think, and engage in a way that is both positive for the telcos and also positive for our community.
Okay, great. Thank you for answering all those questions.
Thank you, Mayor Johnny.
So just out of curiosity, I remember authorizing a pilot project for a small cell with a Philips, right? And those went up on First Street. When did we do Santana Row, and who's that 5G, or who's doing that small cell?
Right. So Philips was a limited number and a pilot, and I believe there's a couple of Verizon cells in those Philips, and there's been no activity to enhance or expand those. This so one of our existing broadband providers was incented through these negotiations to begin deploying what will ultimately be a citywide deployment of these small cells. So these are
This is the Anycom thing?
No, this is a commercial provider. So this is like a Charter Communications or a Pacific Bell or an AT&T or a Verizon that have assigned master licensing agreement with us that are installing these small cells to enhance their 4G signals and give us gigabit level speed on our data.
So I remember it going through council, and we had to look at things like how aesthetically pleasing, let's say, that these installations are. I don't remember. Are these similar looking to the ones that Philips are doing?
Not at all. The Philips were in their smart poles. So we had big poles.
Yeah.
We had big poles and large footprints. These are so within our existing policy and within the existing law, I believe these are devices that the communication providers are allowed to put on poles with a discretionary review by the Public Works Department. And so these have public noticing. They go through a discretionary review process by the city, and they are approved by rules that we have in place within Public Works for these types of equipment.
Okay, so this is not Philips through Verizon through Philips. This is not Anycom. This is another separate company. And they're paying those $2,800 per installation.
Correct. Yes.
That we have on there.
Yeah. This is a matter of public record. This is so those 200 small cells are AT&T. And they are deploying them throughout the city in an equitable fashion and paying that 50% discount on that small cell lease rate.
Okay, so they're getting a 50% discount because they're,
Yeah, so going back to, yeah, doing a little slower through the slides. So as part of, so understand that the way this works within our city is there's a master license agreement that is signed that outlines the rules around attaching small cell devices to poles.
Yes.
And the rates that have to be paid and the process we go through. That doesn't mean that any provider needs to do that because there's no individual agreement put in place with that provider for a commitment. So you can sign a master licensing agreement with the city. You don't have to do anything with it. What these negotiations are doing is working with those broadband providers to get commitment to actually deploy the infrastructure as opposed to just have an agreement that allows them to deploy it if they want to. So with recognizing that we have a need to improve our processes and we also have a need to give fiscal confidence that this demand is going to come, we in this value trading with this provider, they agreed to provide $1 million to the city to be used to re-engineering our permitting processes so they can go faster in working with the city.
Understood. And is that is that a public? Which company is it? Is it, or is that you seem to be a little secretive? And
we haven't have a signed agreement yet, so
okay.
I'm just trying to basically. But I think that it's largely in the public domain at this point. So yeah, AT&T.
Okay.
We're finalizing the agreement with AT&T for their investment in our permitting process in the sum of $1 million.
And these are just 4G cells, sites.
Right.
Okay.
And we've negotiated a lease rate that actually incents them to commit to the build out as opposed to just sit there and wait. Okay. And that's the basis of this negotiation.
I had a question on the 50% discount deal that we have here going. Is it forever, the 50% discount, or
no? It is because we set out a framework for a long-term agreement that included 4G, 5G, and fiber in the same way we're doing with another provider. Okay. In this situation, there was a desire to walk before we can run, so we set the agreement only to 200, and that if after that it's open to, it's basically back to the master lease rate. We expect that after this, the next phase is going to be an even larger deployment, and it's going to include support for digital inclusion, so not only an equitable deployment, but hotspots, free service. And in that, we will also be, we will be negotiating some of that back and forth on our lease rates.
Now, the technology that this 4G technology, it generates data, right? All this stuff is generating any data points?
Yeah, I mean, the analogy is it's just a really small macro cell tower. So it's just normal LTE. It's just making the bars on this go to 5, and it's making the speed go to a gigabit as opposed to a megabit.
Hey, I'm all for that. Maybe you can get Sprint to invest something around here. But I've been talking to some people in this industry, and they said that the city could even make money off becoming, controlling the data points that for each one of these poles. Are you guys looking into any of that?
I think that would be more around Wi-Fi, as opposed to.
But these aren't
LTE.
Wi-Fi. These are just 4G.
These are just mobile data. It's not.
Yeah,
Wi-Fi.
I get those two things confused with Anycom and the other stuff. And
yeah, so players like Anycom or players like Comcast that have Wi-Fi hotspots, those collect data.
Yeah.
And obviously that's valued because of the data they collect and can be used.
Yeah.
There are opportunities with some of our Wi-Fi projects that we're doing for the city. In this situation, we don't have the ability to negotiate any rights to the telco providers' 4G small cell data transmissions.
Okay, and as far as the Anycom deal, how is that going? Is it green, red, yellow?
We're
We've got a major milestone in that coming up. So at the moment, it's green, and we'll keep the entire council informed as we go forward.
Okay, thank you.
Lon?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So along those same lines, with the digital inclusion aspect of this, if we're dealing with 4G and not Wi-Fi, how do these microcell providers, how are they eligible for the 50% discount when all they're doing is increasing the speed of the 4G? So in order to be inclusive, for a kid to be able to do internet at home when their family can't afford, at-home wired service, how are they getting a benefit?
Right. So in the citywide negotiation, what's on the table are what our position is that this provider would have 33% of the market share. So they should be providing 33% of our 100,000 people a free hotspot and free service. So they can basically take this hotspot and use it to get free service.
I see.
And so that is the ultimate model we want to use, because so there's two elements we want to promote: is an equitable deployment and then digital inclusion. So if there's none of this technology gets deployed to East San Jose, then it doesn't matter if you have a device because you can't get the service. So we limited this to this agreement to the discount level and nothing more, and we limited it to duration because it was an equitable build out. If you look at our digital exclusion heat map and we overlaid the actual cells, there was a good fit. So there will be deployments in East San Jose, on the east side, as well as central, and areas where we have a high concentration of digitally excluded communities. The next phase that we've agreed in concept, but we didn't put into an agreement, is to give is to negotiate that digital inclusion in a next agreement.
Okay. I want to ask about the strategy. You guys said earlier that when 5G rolls out, basically all the 4G hardware becomes obsolete. Maybe that was a joke, but so I guess my question really is, does it make sense to invest in tricking out our 4G now if 5G is on the horizon? Shouldn't we just be saving our capital and resources and going whole hog into 5G and just let the 4G thing burn, like skip an iteration?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the current thinking is that this will be an upgrade to the existing equipment in place plus new. So the reason it's plus new is because 5G transmits at a higher frequency, so it has a shorter distance, so you just need more of them. Mm-hmm. So I think the previous statement about 4G will be thrown out or taken down isn't true. The work that is done to run fiber to the poles and to power the poles 24/7 will be leveraged, and we'll just be swapping out new equipment, which will make things go faster. So there is no sunk cost on the city's part, and there isn't a lot of sunk cost on the provider's part because they're upgrading equipment.
Okay. And just throwing this out there, is, as the capital of the Silicon Valley, is there an attempt for us to offer like eventually free broadband, but maybe a lower speed, so you can actually pay to get the higher speed somewhere, but just citywide Wi-Fi?
So our broadband strategy that we adopted basically said we're going to continue to be opportunistic until we have clarity on the Facebook trial, as well as Access Eastside. Once we have a little bit better insights into how well this is adopted and how well some of the new technologies work versus the old technologies, we need to develop a citywide Wi-Fi strategy. We really don't have one at this point, and part of it is because we're using these innovation projects to explore what technologies work and what technologies don't work. If some of the newer technologies can't get very far into a building, then that's going to inform us. Sure. So we're expecting that later this fall, one of the items we potentially will be adding to the innovation roadmap is our citywide Wi-Fi strategy.
Sure.
It's not an easy thing to solve. Palo Alto just rejected citywide Wi-Fi, But yeah, part of the question is there a free level of service at a lower level and a paid level service at a higher level to pay for the capital and the underlying? And those are all things that we have to figure out, but we're waiting for some of these projects that are on the roadmap to come to a point that we know enough to make that decision.
Sure. And then my last question, I guess, is could you outline some of the things that the city needs to do to entice the private sector to invest the $2 billion? Like you say, the curve there was like if we do some things and we put out there, we encourage the private sector to start investing to pick things up. And one of the examples you cited was the permitting thing. We invest in the permitting and they get to move faster.
Correct.
But other than that, what else do we got to do?
Well, from their perspective, if we reduced our lease rate and our permitting fees to zero,
Okay.
then we'd see a lot of investment, but what we wouldn't have any leverage to incent the equitable deployment and the digital inclusion, which is really our policy. So that's why we have latitude, and we're using that latitude on the lease rates. But at the end of the day, they want speed and they want predictability. And so it really, and then third, cost savings. So it really focuses on getting our permit to install process faster and more predictable. And then we will see where the nation winds up with broadband legislation on our lease fees.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. I just actually have two quick questions, and actually I think you answered the first one, and that was on the citywide negotiations. Whether 300 4G small cells would cover the whole city, and with the contrast that with the 3,000 5G small cells. And if I understood you correctly, that the 4G has a broader spectrum and it requires less. So 300 cell sites, small cells, would cover the whole city of San Jose?
Right. So what small cells are doing is amplifying the transmissions from the macro cell towers at slower speeds but farther distance. So 200, 300 is about what a telecom provider would need to provide basic level enhancements throughout the city. But that is not going to deliver the gigabit level speeds, the massive input, massive output, the low latency that things like autonomous vehicles need. So when you look at the explosive growth of data and the Internet of Things, the 4G technology just isn't going to cut it.
Right.
So we could stop at, let's say we have 5 major providers times 400 small cells. We could stop at 1,600 small cells, but that's not going to give us a 21st century infrastructure we want. And our fully autonomous vehicles would just get stuck at intersections and can't move because they can't transmit fast enough to figure out what to do. So we've estimated part of the numbers that Mike Liu in Public Works and I looked at is looking over 7 years, what is the projected volume of these 4G and 5G small cells, assuming we generate the demand and fulfill the demand. And we're looking at 6,000, 7,000 was our number. In collaborating with other cities, Los Angeles is looking at over 10,000, which makes sense because they're bigger, but not in the same way geographically. So we to take our infrastructure into the 21st century, we needed several hundreds, if not a few thousand 4G small cells, but we're looking at 6,000 5G small cells.
Great. Next question was around the revenue. So for the new permitting revenue, that's all cost recovery for both the incremental and citywide negotiations?
Correct. It's new in that it's being sourced from small cell permits, but it is cost recovery based only.
And so for the new lease revenue over 5 years, so incremental, it's 1.5 million. So would we, for the citywide negotiations, would we be looking at a comparable factor of say 3 times, 22.5 million?
I'll let you know in a couple weeks.
Okay.
With this, when you're looking at the citywide deployment, it just becomes more of a numbers game. So I don't know where we're going to end up. Like I said, when we're looking at the entire city and we're including equity and inclusion, what we're looking at is making sure all costs are covered, and the cost of closing the digital divide is one of those costs. So we're looking at it from a total cost basis in the way the World Bank would look at solving an entire problem. And we're going to see where that gets us, because right now the positional negotiating on lease rates isn't going to get us there in this situation. So that's where I'll let you know where we are in a couple weeks. And if, again, our strategy is everything we're doing, if this negotiation doesn't work, there are other options, which is moving closer to some government-led interventions. But we hope to be able to, find that tipping point with a citywide negotiation. I don't know where we're going to land on that lease revenue.
Great. Thank you, and thank you for that report.
Can I just have one follow-up? Thank you.
Okay.
Nolan, are you leading the investigation or the negotiation, or is it Kip, or are you at the table, or?
I'm at the table.
You are?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And are you, who's sort of taking the lead on the negotiations? Is that you, or?
So the way this is, so the most effective use, I mean, if you were going to hire someone to do this role, you'd probably want someone with about 30 years of telecom experience that still has relationships in the telecoms, and you hired that person. So it makes sense that I'm at the table doing these negotiations.
Right.
In the background, I'm consulting with Kip. I'm also consulting with Kim Wallish on economic development.
Sure.
I work very closely with Mike on the cost. So there's a team working on behind this, but in terms of being at the table, it's me.
It's you, and so you'll be doing all of these negotiations as others come up as well.
Job security, yes.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, good. It's just good to know that we're not like taking, just reassuring to know there's one person who's got the expertise.
Right. I think that in this type of negotiation, the telecom expertise and the existing relationships that are key. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't make sense to have anyone else at the table at this point in time.
Cool. Thank you, Nolan.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mayor. Blair, you're up.
Hi, I guess I'm going to try to practice just going to try to dive in. I'm going to talk about stuff, and I may be really limited in how to talk about it. I'm sorry, but hopefully it can, if it doesn't make a good broad point, hopefully it's a good way that I can learn how to talk about this stuff. So, I guess to say that I hope the 5G stuff can be healthy as you practice that into the future. I hope you learn how to really talk to the public more as you plan to put 5G in different places. And like the committee that was on Hofstadter that put up a cell tower in Cappy Jones district a year ago, that was quite a battle, and you worked out quite a good compromise out of that, I think. And I hope that can just be the model and standard of how you work the future of 5G, that you really get the public, the neighborhood involved in each location and setting. I find 5G pretty unhealthy, and I'm pretty nervous about it. I really hope that you can practice the ideas of underground cabling that I hear around the City Hall. That's really comforting. That I don't know how 5G exactly works, but I just wish there was a way that, from a few simple transmitters, it can then all be put underground. And I think it would just solve a lot of problems, but I don't know the depth of that, but hopefully that's what can be worked on. And I guess that's about it for now. If I think anything else, I'll bring it up. Thank you.
Hey, Blair, can you stay right where you are? Thank you. Can I get a motion to accept the report, please?
So moved.
Been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Motion passes. Thank you. So now we're going to open forum. So, Blair, take it away.
Okay, try to make a few points of interest. I feel 5G, as it's called small cell, I really think its name, from what I've seen of the large cabinets, that it should be something called like medium cell. And from the earlier conversation, the Facebook stuff you're working on, that's small cell. I mean, that's the very definition of what looks like small cell. Whereas the 5G cabinets, that looks more like a medium cell kind of thing. I hope you can learn to work on that language. Just for your information, data collection, I think, is going to be an important issue in 2018. And, you know, with the body camera work, with your rental registry work, there's important work going on in the East Bay and Oakland and in Berkeley right now on this subject that I hope your city government can really look into. I think you'd be really, you'd be impressed with the work that's going on there. I guess with that in mind, thank you very much for coming up with a privacy policy group in a working group in San Jose this year. I think that'll be a great idea. And again, you know, just as civil rights and civil protections, they have to be a very important component in how you think of privacy policy. And it's a very important part. And it's fun, and it's hopeful, and it's a good hobby and all that stuff. And yeah, and from a hobby, it just becomes a real nice part of our lives. Finally, I guess, about the mayor wanting to expand his thinking. I really hope to remind you the good of civil rights and civil protection ideas and guidelines and all that good stuff is so much more important if you're going to make the attempts to enter the, you know, capitalist business world at this time. And good civil protections, good guidelines that can help that process and keep yourself secure.
Hate to cut you off, Blair, you were on a roll, but thank you for that input.
Yep.
All right.
Certainly.
Means adjourn.